Calling the meeting to order. Et je vous souhaite la bienvenue au
And I wish to welcome you to the Social Affairs, Science and Technology Committee. There you go.
Scotia, Chair of the Committee, and I'm going to start by inviting my colleagues to introduce themselves, starting on my left.
Art Eggleton, Senator from Toronto and Deputy Chair of the Committee.
Tony Dean, Senator for Ontario.
Chantal Petitclerc, Sénatrice du Québec.
Chantal Petitclerc, Senator from Quebec.
Edmonton. Carolyn Stewart-Olson, New Brunswick.
Judith Siebman from Montreal, Quebec.
For everyone's benefit, I remind us that we continue our study on the role of robotics, 3D printing, and artificial intelligence in the healthcare system. And we were very pleased to have two witnesses with us who I will identify as I welcome them to speak. And since there's no predetermined order, I'm going to go in the order they appear on my list, which would mean that in the first instance I will invite Dr. Bengio, who is Director and Professor at the University of Montreal, with the Montreal Institute for Learning Algorithms. So, Dr. Bengio, please.
Thank you. So it's a pleasure to be here. I had this group at Université de Montréal, which has been a pioneer in artificial intelligence, in particular in the area called deep learning, which I've seen you already heard about in previous meetings. And in the last 10 years since this breakthrough in deep learning happened, the lab grew a lot. And we now have the largest concentration of deep learning researchers and students in academia across the world. So let me say a few words about the progress that has happened in AI. Computers are now much better able to understand at least some aspects of the world and take good decisions that can help us in many different ways. But that's probably just the beginning of approaching human-level intelligence. We don't know how far this is in the future, but even with the progress that's been achieved up to now scientifically, there will be major economic and social impact of these advances in the next decade. So, for example, there's been breakthrough in the last few years using deep learning to allow computers to recognize the content of images, to understand speech, that is, to translate the sounds to words. That doesn't mean they understand what they mean. To translate from one language to another, to control robots, to control cars, to plan sophisticated sequences of actions, for example, playing complex games like the game of Go and beating the world champion last year. So what's particular about all this is that it's the same underlying science, same technology, which is behind all of these advances and more that I won't have time to tell you. So it's fairly horizontal and general purpose, which is why it can have such a big impact on the economy in general and many different kinds of applications. So what's interesting about this for Canada is that Canada has been a leader in that science, the science of AI, in particular deep learning, with a lot of the progress having happened in Toronto and Montreal, and to some extent in Edmonton, in the area of reinforcement learning especially. And these Canadian academics have been really leading the world in this area. But unfortunately, most of the business investment in this area has been elsewhere, has been mostly in the USA, and to some extent, maybe even more actually now in China, and to some extent in the UK. So a lot of Canadian academics and former graduates have moved out of the country, so we had this brain drain for a number of years. However, the tide is turning. The Canadian and provincial governments have realized the strategic importance of AI, and are starting to invest both for continuing to advance the fundamental research and to promote innovation, connecting universities and companies in Canada. So, for example, in Montreal, if we add up the different grants and promises that governments and companies have made just over the last year for the next 5 years, And what we are expecting with high probability in the coming year, we're talking about more than $500 million in just Montreal. And Toronto, I guess, is about the same. So something is really changing in the Canadian scene, both in universities and in the makeup of the ecosystems of small and large companies that are investing in AI. For example, in Montreal, in less than the last 12 months, there's been less than the last 6 months, there's been announcements from major multinationals to create research labs in deep learning. So it started with Google, then Microsoft, now just last week Facebook, Huawei and IBM and others. So this is important to note because the economic impact of these advances is expected by economists and scientists to be major. Probably comparable or even more important than the impact that electrification had in the previous century, at the beginning of the 20th century. But probably happening faster, which is something, of course, that we could be concerned about. For example, it's been estimated that more than half of the jobs, this is a U.S. study, but we can imagine the same thing happening in Canada, will be partially or completely automated, bringing new products and services and increasing productivity greatly, but also leading to potential negative impacts in terms of unemployment. Now, there will also be new jobs created, but they will be in different places. Of course, there'll be, and one thing we care a lot about here is creating a lot of these technology jobs. But of course, the people who are losing their jobs are not the same kinds that have a PhD or a master's and are going to be creating this technology. However, there'll also be new jobs in non-routine work, and also jobs that involve more work created for people who are involved in jobs involving a strong relational or human aspect. I don't want to have a robot take care of my children, for example. So there will be a transition, and this transition could be painful and involve a lot of human suffering. So it is important to start thinking about it and to think about how our social systems, social security and education systems may need to be adapted to these changes in the next decade, roughly. One thing, financially speaking, that is important is that a lot of wealth will be created with AI, but mostly that wealth will be in countries where that technology is being developed, in where those companies that are creating it are. So we'd like Canada to be a producer of AI and not just a consumer. Every country in the world is going to be a consumer of these things and may suffer some of those negative impacts. So we'd like to have that wealth created in our tax base, at least sufficiently so that we can pay for those transitions that are coming. Hence, the efforts of governments to stimulate innovation and technology transfer in this area are very important. In particular, a crucial element of this is talent, the expertise that we have or that we can attract. And for this, for example, in Montreal and Toronto and Edmonton, we are creating AI institutes that will allow us to provide the best in the world facilities for researchers doing fundamental research in AI, as well as surround these people with groups of applied researchers and innovation technologists who will connect that talent with local industry and stimulate the creation of small and large companies. Another important thing that is being discussed in the community and also with governments is that it's important not just to think about the profitable applications of AI, but also to think about those applications that have socially positive impact, may not be profitable, but may be important for many people. For example, I guess as is important for this committee, applications in the medical areas. But it could be in other areas, say providing free services to the poorest, that could be useful for a lot of people. So in MILA, my institute, we're already working with dozens of companies and about 100 companies are knocking on our door to work with us. And many new companies are created, sometimes by the students in the lab and sometimes by outsiders who come and ask us for technical help. In particular, we also work with companies in the medical area and also with medical researchers in hospitals to explore the numerous medical applications of deep learning and AI. One example that I'm connected to is a company called Imagia, which has developed a cancer detection system for a particular kind of intestinal cancer from medical images to identify the parts of the image which contain cancerous cells. And according to their test, they can do that better, slightly better than the best doctors and much better than the average doctors. So in addition to all this investment in basic science and innovation, one thing that I and others believe is that we must start thinking about the social and ethical implications of these changes and begin a discussion in our society involving not just the scientists and the engineers, but also the experts in the social sciences, humanities, and ethics who have something important to say about how to handle those changes. As an analogy, and I think as a motivation for doing this kind of work, think about how much misery, human misery and political turmoil could have been avoided if at the end of the 19th century people in power had realized that the upcoming industrial revolution would do a lot of damage before it would bring a lot of wealth. And if we had put the social security net that ended up happening in the 40s and 50s and 60s earlier, say at the beginning of the 20th century, a lot of that misery would have been avoided. So this is something to inspire us. And the last thing I want to mention regarding the social aspects and the ethical aspects is one of the concerns that people in my community have, and we are having a lot of discussions already around the world about this, is how those advances in AI could be used in ethically wrong ways. And one of the most salient example of this is the use of AI in autonomously lethal weapons. Weapons that can kill without a human involved in the decision. And there's already been letters 2 years ago signed, that DAI signed, and many others signed to ask governments to work on this. And actually there is a committee at the UN currently working on this question. So I will stop here for my little speech.
Thank you very much. I will now turn to Dr. Ferguson-Pell, who is a professor at the University of Alberta, but is appearing before us as an individual. Dr. Ferguson-Pell, please.
Thank you very much. I'm part of the Faculty of Rehabilitation Medicine at the University of Alberta, so a lot of the focus of what I'm going to talk about is really the use of what I would describe as a toolkit that can help us to address problems in rehabilitation and chronic disease management. I'm actually going to sort of touch on three areas, although the scope can be much larger. One of them is the delivery of care to people in remote rural communities. The second is in the area of prosthetics, and the third is in the area of enhancing the effectiveness of education. And so the toolkit really comprises a whole series of different kinds of technologies. Some of them we link closely to robotics, some of them more loosely. For example, virtual reality and augmented reality are rapidly growing areas which I think have enormous potential in the three areas that I've identified. And I'd like to use my time mainly talking about the virtual reality, augmented reality side of things. So the problem we have for people who live in remote rural communities is the enormous expense of either getting clinicians to them or getting them to clinicians, or both. And in the area of chronic disease management, one of the challenges is that a lot of the care these patients need is, in a way, serial or longitudinal care. It's not a single face-to-face interaction and a diagnosis is made and maybe a surgery performed and it's all over and the problem solved, but long-term care over many years. And this becomes extremely difficult for people living in remote rural communities, indigenous reserves, and also in the military as well. So when we think of telemedicine, we tend to think, I think, of a webcam sitting on top of a flat screen and maybe a group of people in a room talking together. And in a way, that's the way telemedicine tends to be delivered, in that it tends to be more of a discussion rather than a physical interaction. But at the University of Alberta Faculty of Rehab Medicine, for the last 5 or 6 years, we've been delivering a master's degree for professional physical therapists and occupational therapists remotely at 2 separate sites simultaneously. So we have our hub in Edmonton, and then we have 2 satellite programs, one in Camrose and the other one in Calgary. And the reason we established this was because we were finding that clinical professionals tended to settle where they were trained. And that meant in a province like Alberta, we had very patchy access to these professionals. And so what we put in place was a very advanced way of delivering what we call synchronous teaching to these students, where we would have a generalist instructor at the remote site and a specialist instructor at the hub site. And so what the generalist would do would then follow the instructions of the specialist instructor and take the students through whatever the topic of the class would be. So our sense is, well, if we can do that and instruct students, then why can't we do similar things in a very hands-on way in the delivery of care to patients in remote communities? One of the challenges is we need information that we take for granted when it's a face-to-face interaction with patients, but isn't available to us when we have someone in a remote location. For example, the sense of touch, or the sense of a force being exerted by the patient, or certain nuances in terms of the anatomy of the patient that we need to be able to monitor while the patient performs a certain series of activities. These are all part of how a typical assessment would be done. And so what we're now able to do, and what's interesting at very affordable prices, essentially is to put together a toolkit, less than $10,000, that could be located at a remote clinic with a generalist clinician who would be able to follow the instructions of a specialist clinician who would be based at a hub urban center. The Internet of Things is essentially a whole toolkit of different types of sensors that can be plugged into the Internet, and then the data that they're generating received at another location. And so what we're doing is beginning to put together the necessary components to undertake a series of different kinds of clinical assessment, in many cases longitudinal, over a period of weeks or months. And this can include the sense of force, the ability to see in detail certain features of the patient, the ability to measure movement of different parts of the body in a very accurate and quantitative way. We can use it, for example, to look at things like the stability of the patient. So if they have a concussion, or they may have some other form of impairment that may affect their ability to maintain an upright stance, then we're able to monitor that. Someone who's had a stroke, and we want to be able to monitor what may be happening, for example, with visual neglect. All of these things can be done using these relatively inexpensive sensors. Now, the thing is that when you're doing this, you're generating many channels of data at the same time. And so the concept that we're developing, and we've got and demonstrated in our lab, is that we send raw data down the internet pipe to the urban center, and then build a series of apps that can then interpret that data and present it to the clinician, to the specialist clinician, using a display system. It could be VR goggles, or it could be something like the HoloLens augmented reality display. And the advantage that this gives us is the ability to port to the data that we're interested in. So if you can imagine, you're sitting there, and in front of you virtually are displayed a series of dashboards, each dashboard representing a different sensor. So you want to look at what's happening to muscle activity, so you glance across it, and then you move close up in the virtual world to that display. Then maybe you want to look at something else. You may want to look at a force measurement, so you then look in the other direction, and then you move across to that. Now, in the package I sent you is what is inspiring us. And this is some work that Microsoft is doing using a technique called holoportation. And what holoportation does is truly Star Trek. In what it enables us to do is to take a three-dimensional representation of a person in a remote location live and port that person's image in 3D over to a second location, in our case the urban center. So if you have a look at the handout that I gave you, there's a link, and you can play a little YouTube video of Microsoft demonstrating holoportation. I believe that within the next 3 to 5 years, this will become a mainstream technology and will revolutionize our ability to interact with patients in remote locations. So I think that what we're beginning to do is to put in place the building blocks, and then this technology will will enable us to do some remarkable clinical things. Now, why is this important to Canada? I would say Canada is in the perfect position to be the living lab that develops these technologies. Just look at Alberta alone. You have 2 outstanding urban centers in terms of the quality of medical care being provided. In Alberta, we have a single healthcare system, Alberta Health Services, and we have a huge geographic footprint that we're responsible for. And so if we wanted the perfect environment to start to demonstrate these technologies, Canada's in a great position to do that. And why is that economically important? Because when you start to put those apps together, those technologies together, they can then be applied to many other remote locations around the world, such as China and Africa, Australia, Scotland, many other places that struggle with this problem of delivering care to people in remote locations. So I just wanted to bring to your attention what I think is a very exciting opportunity, both clinically, both to patients the federal government is responsible for, such as Indigenous people and people in Canadian forces, and also to look at the opportunity to develop these technologies for economic benefit as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you both very much, and I'm now going to open up the floor to my colleagues, and we will begin with Senator Eggleton, to be followed by Senator Stewart-Olson, to be followed by Senator Seaman.
Well, thank you very much for both of you for your presentations. They're both quite informative for this purpose of meetings. Dr. Bengio, I'll start with you. Thank you for raising the issues of social and ethical implications of these changes. You talked about the disruption in terms of employment for many people. Yes, there'll be new jobs created, but there'll be a lot of them ultimately will be lost. I think those are important issues to raise. The question also comes to mind as to how far should we be going? Where should we draw the lines in terms of artificial intelligence, automated systems? You've drawn one line yourself. You said you wouldn't want your kids looked after by a robot. Well, some of these things, particularly as you get into deep learning, as I understand it, you can have machines that could be quite powerful, quite influential, and potentially could be harmful in some respects. It could be very manipulative of a person, exercising undue influence. And I'm talking about this in the medical field. You've already said, well, there's one example of something we shouldn't allow, and that's autonomous lethal weapons. But okay, let me take it into the healthcare area. I understand that and agree with that. But let me take it into the healthcare area. Where should we be drawing lines here? Because we need to think in advance where a lot of this may be going, so that we don't get down a path that develops this in a harmful way. So, can you comment on that? Comment on where we might draw the line?
Let's see. For now, I think of the kinds of tools that are going to be developed in the next few years with deep learning for medical applications, mostly as providing simply additional elements of information to doctors, at least in countries like Canada. I don't see these things as replacing doctors in any ways. We still want doctors to interact with people. So I don't have like a specific example of where I could see this go wrong in the medical applications. One area, of course, is that, which is related, is the question of private data, right? So there is a social dilemma between, on one hand, I'd like my personal information to be not used for anything that would, make it in danger of, being available to people who shouldn't have access to it. And at the same time, for deep learning and AI to really succeed, we need to pull together the data from millions of people. And so there's a balance here that needs to be struck. I don't see this as a danger, rather than, trying to find the right balance between the individual needs for privacy and the collective need for better treatment. So I don't know if you have something in mind.
Well, let me give you one example, because it's been raised here before, and that's what I think we're calling Dr. Watson at IBM.
Yeah.
And its ability to perhaps have a better record of diagnosis than some physicians. So the concern here is over the influence that this will have on the medical community, that the physician will feel that they have to bow to the machine when their instincts might suggest otherwise, simply because there's a better statistical analysis. And when you're dealing with your patient, looking for the best odds is probably more.
So I'm not too concerned. I think it is an issue, but I'm not too concerned. I think right now, maybe some doctors, and probably many doctors, are afraid and would say, "Oh, I'm not going to use this thing, this robot." But really, once you get used to having machines do things and compute quantities for you, and you get to know about their reliability from experience, it's not very different from a doctor using a test that's been done with a robot that looks at the blood of a patient and comes up with numbers. I mean, the doctor didn't actually do the tests herself. She trusts that, the machine counting the cells is doing it right. Mm-hmm. So, I'm not that concerned about this aspect.
Okay, if I may ask Dr. Martin Ferguson-Pell a question. What you're describing here is fascinating stuff, and I think there has been a lot of concern about being able to provide good medical treatment to people in rural areas. So your telemedicine program would appear to be quite promising in that regard. How is it funded? Do you get to most remote communities? It would still, I imagine, involve a fair expense. This is very high-tech equipment. And are you able to have a very extensive reach into Alberta?
So this is proof of concept stage at this point. So we're not delivering care right now, but we've been very carefully considering that question from several standpoints. One of them is the funding, and the other one is the speed at which you can develop this technology so that you can stay ahead of the competition. And one of the challenges with any telemedicine system, when you're dealing with a primary healthcare system, is the privacy management that is introduced by that healthcare system, which slows down your ability to develop. And so we're looking at this in a sort of three-pronged way. We're looking at it from the standpoint that many of the services that we're getting started with are ones that can be provided through the typical physical therapy clinic, which is a private pay clinic. So many of the services that people receive for physical therapy is out-of-pocket cost. So that enables us to get started without getting caught up in the complexity of how do we get a policy change or a change in the funding model within the healthcare system that would deal with the fact that we've got multiple clinicians now, generalist, specialist, and then also maybe there are others involved in the team, such as doctors and physical therapists with different roles. So that's one way of expediting the development from a technological standpoint.
But hopefully, eventually, you get into the healthcare system.
Oh, absolutely, we intend to. And also, that's why the other third prong is the opportunity to work with Canadian forces.
Oh, okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Senator Stewart Olson to be followed by Senator Seaman.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you both for being here. I have one question for each of you. Professor Bengio, one of the things that we really see with these technologies is the changing world. And I'm wondering, have you given thought to the preparation of our youth? And I think really it almost has to go right back to either beginning high school or even grade school when they start to think about a career path.
Yes.
What should they be thinking about? Because these are going to be the jobs. The other jobs are going to be changing. So how can they move forward with that? And what should they be thinking about?
So, because the changes are going to be very fast, I believe that it's really important that our education system prepares our youth to be fairly broadly educated. Because if they specialize in something and then that something gets to be automated, it's pretty bad for them. So that's one aspect. The other aspect, it's pretty obvious that we want to encourage youth who are going to contribute to the development of these technologies, so computer scientists especially and engineers. And there's already an effect of all the discussions in the media about AI and the breakthroughs that have happened recently that I can see. So colleges, calling us and asking, if they can visit, and students in undergrad and high school being interested. So we need more of that, obviously, because Canada needs to have as many of these high-paying salaries. We're going to create that technology here. So what else? And I think we need to continue carefully evaluating where things are moving, and if you look at what economists are writing or just your good sense, you can make fairly good guesses. And so the people in charge of curriculums in schools and colleges, I think, need to pay attention to that to try to tell the students about what's going on so that they make the right choices.
Thank you. And Dr. Ferguson-Pell, your demonstrations and what Alberta is doing are fantastic. I come from New Brunswick, which is an area we don't have a medical school. And so are these done in silos? Like, would you do your telemedicine strictly to Alberta, remote Alberta, or can you envision a Canada where a school in British Columbia can provide this kind of learning for someone in New Brunswick, for a school in New Brunswick or a class in New Brunswick?
Absolutely. So one example of this at the moment in our faculty is around stuttering. So we have an institute called iStar, which is to help people who stutter overcome this disability. And we're delivering stuttering therapy, essentially, to countries in the Middle East. And so this becomes simply a matter, I think, of, in a way, financial logistics in terms of how you manage the resources that are needed in order to deliver it. And to some degree, some harmonization in the methodology so that we agree on some basic protocols as to how to deliver a particular kind of assessment. So take someone who's got an injured rotator cuff. We would have rather like a standard operating procedure that we would want to follow using this technology so that we go through a systematic assessment of that person's rotator cuff. And we'd want that to be harmonized with other collaborating provinces or other organizations so that we can get it done smoothly and quickly. With all of these things, a lot of the cost is around how long it takes to do the assessment. And that means that the technology must be seamless and reliable. So you plug it in and off we go. And we've all had that experience with video conferencing. And secondly, the protocols can help us to do that. But to give you confidence that this is doable, I would say the experience we've had in teaching the physical therapists and occupational therapists in the remote locations, they're not so remote, Calgary and Camrose, but co-located groups, we've demonstrated that those students, when they graduate, who sit the national exam, come out with equivalent or better marks to the ones that have face-to-face. So I'm very confident this will work and give good quality care, but we do need some degree of harmonization.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Seidman to be followed by Senator Dean, to be followed by Senator Unger.
Thank you, Chair. And thank you both very much for being here. As a Montrealer, I really have to direct my questions to you, Professor Bengio, and to start out by congratulating you sincerely for the enormous efforts you've put into creating this hub in Montreal. And I have collected the newspaper clippings, watching Google and Microsoft, and feeling really energized and really excited about that. In your presentation to us today, you have said very clearly that something is changing, and we're moving in new directions. And you've said that to keep our talent and attract more, we need to provide the best in the world facilities. And you want us, Canada, to be a producer of AI products, not just a consumer. So you're already demonstrating that in Montreal. And what I'd like to ask you is, if you use Montreal as a model for other potential hubs in the country, which I hope is what happens.
This is what happens.
Mm-hmm. And so I'd like to know what were the positive assets. What is the model that you're going to transmit to other parts of the country? So what were the positive assets, and what were the particular challenges that you overcame?
So the core asset is critical mass of talent, and I mean the top-level talent. So people, researchers, professors, PhD students, postdocs, who are doing the best research in the world, concentrated in one place, working together and attracting the attention of not just the scientific community, but also the business community. So this is what happened. And another thing that happened is a sort of shift in the attitudes of investors and business people, and I think this is just the beginning, that is making it possible for AI startups to actually happen here in Canada and not be immediately sucked to the Silicon Valley. Because it used to be the case that Canadians would start companies, high-tech companies, and as soon as they reached a certain level, they would be not necessarily bought, but investors who are sufficiently risk-taking. There wouldn't be enough of them here in Canada, and so they would be essentially people from California, and they would say, come to the Valley because we want to be close to you. And so a lot of companies left like this, and now that has changed. Both Canadian investors are starting to understand that asset that we have here, and foreign investors also understand that if they want to be part of this game, they have to accept that Canadian companies are going to stay here in Canada. And so, just the competition effect is really moving things in the right direction. But in general, I would say, to come back to my first answer about critical mass, it's a virtuous circle. And that's why the intervention of governments is so important. It's sort of, pumping the motor to get it started, and then it's sort of, growing in the right direction. And we probably need to continue pumping to some extent, but now, big business is coming in, and there are still challenges. So you asked me about challenges. I think in general, there's still a lot to change in the mentality of investors in Canada. They're very conservative, and even more conservative are the big corporate in Canada, big companies. They're not used to make these kinds of bold investments into the future. They want to be reassured that whatever they're going to buy is going to be safe. So somehow we need to change that. And I know that some companies are starting to open up, but this is something that needs to change.
Okay. If I would like to ask you the same question, Professor Ferguson-Pell, and as long as I can have a second round to ask Professor Bengio another question.
We'll put you on a second round, but I can't guarantee anything.
Okay, fine. Okay. So if I could ask you, because obviously you're a huge innovator as well, and I must say the idea of holoportation is really something that is Star Trek. I mean, I can visualize it. So I'd like to ask you the very same question as I just asked Professor Bengio, if I might.
So just to make sure I remember your questions, the first part of the question really, I think, is what are some of the drivers for this innovation, and what resources, if you like, or investment is necessary to make it successful? And I think that's a pretty challenging question in this context, because there are actually a lot of stakeholders. One of the stakeholders, in a way, is our moral conscience, and that is the importance of providing equity in access to healthcare, which is a very powerful principle of Canadian healthcare. And we know there's a lot of data to show the inequities that people who live in remote and rural settings experience simply because of where they're located. And so I can't promise that this technology will necessarily directly reduce costs, in that you could do simplistic calculations and say, well, that person, instead of them having to travel from a remote location to Edmonton, it costs $5,000. That will pay for half of this toolkit that could maybe be helpful to 100 patients. That's a simplistic way of looking at it, because they probably would never have made that trip in the first place for a lot of the conditions that we're talking about. So this is an investment in part in fairness, as well as an investment in, I think, developing a technology that has the potential for economic benefit to Canada more widely. Secondly, the stakeholders then are pretty diffuse, because, as we were saying a few minutes ago, this technology can be beneficial to multiple provinces, in fact all provinces and beyond. And so I think that federal support to help to develop these technologies from an innovation standpoint, I think, is important. And it has already provided that support. We have had CFI funding, we've had MITAX funding. They're exactly the kind of funding we need to do this kind of work. It's more difficult to position this kind of work in the CIHR context. So those programs are critically important to enable this sort of thing to happen. Industry investment, I think there are opportunities. The MITAX funding, for example, we received was a consequence of an investment that TELUS Health made. And so I think companies that are involved in communications can see benefits. They may be collateral benefits in that they're seeing increased utilization of their IT infrastructure. So they're not actually investing directly because they are obtaining a new industrial growth around a health technology, but they're getting these secondary benefits. So these are the kinds of complexities I think we're working with in this area.
Okay, and this contributes, I'm just thinking about Professor Bengio's point that Canada must be a producer so that we can then export that technology and benefit from that aspect, not only within our country but outside our country. Is that
Yes.
the point you're making?
And there are some technologies where it's more difficult to do that than others, simply because there are many other players in the field. And so in order to be truly successful and nimble and get to market fast, you have to have the kind of venture investment and angel investment with the confidence behind it that Dr. Bengio was talking about to really be the first to market. And we are frequently not first to market because we don't have that culture. In this particular case, I think what I'm suggesting is we have geography on our side. And that's, I think, our opportunity to maybe get ahead of this game, because we've got the medical centres and the excellence in healthcare. We've got a publicly funded healthcare system that is nicely positioned to be able to do this sort of thing. We've got the geography and we've got the technology. So we've got a sweet spot to work with.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much.
Senator Dean, to be followed by Senator Unger, to be followed by Senator Petitclerc. Senator Dean.
Thanks, Chair. Thank you both. Terrific and exciting stuff. I want to talk a little bit about the role of government. We've heard about government priming the well, or pumping, and that funding is important. We've heard both of you say that. Are there other things, when we think about success factors in this terrific decade-long success story, that government can do other than providing funding? Or is it just simply a matter of provide the funding and then stay out of the way? So that's the first question. And the second one is to go back to, we know about the virtuous, positive social and economic impacts of this. I want to return to the negative ones, and without the particulars, because many of the negative aspects of this, by the very nature of the technology, will be unpredictable by virtue of its kind of disruptive nature. Where does responsibility lie in terms of governance? You know, who's got the lead on thinking about and looking at and having responsibility for mapping, attempting to foresee some of the downside consequences of this? We've heard that health inequity is one. The exportation of benefits to others, while they may not be available to some in our home country, is obviously another. Any thoughts on those questions?
So about the role of governments besides initiating the kind of innovation that we're seeing in AI, as I mentioned, our ability to keep and actually bring to Canada the best people in the area, scientists, but also entrepreneurs, for example, is closely connected. So one important aspect of this is our immigration process. In my own life as a professor, I encounter a lot of issues with students having trouble, especially the students coming on short-term internships and things like that. But even grad students coming and being delayed one session and then deciding to go to another university elsewhere in the world. So I believe that we could do a better job to make the process of getting visas and work permits and so on seamless, faster, and especially for these areas that are critical like this, but I think ideally for everyone. So that's one place I think where it matters in terms of policy. The other place which is difficult is regarding sharing of data. So, as you know, health is mostly dealt in the provinces, and provinces, for example, like Quebec and Ontario, are doing pretty nice work trying to centralize their medical data. And this is going to become really important for AI. But each province is doing it separately. So I'm not sure, how we're going to be able to deal with this. But as a country, we would be able to not only provide better healthcare, but export our systems and be much more competitive if we found ways for the different provinces to allow researchers and companies involved in the development of these products to have access to shared data. Of course, in all the with all the techniques that are used to make sure the data isn't leaking in any way. So it's a jurisdiction problem where maybe the federal government could have a role in bringing to the table the different provinces.
I would add first of all, I would absolutely agree on the data point, and I would add an extra dimension to that in that data can be used in a number of different ways, and as academics, our interest is in using data on the whole for research purposes. So we need to be able to access that data supported by appropriate ethics approval. Ethics approval becomes complex because that means individual patients in some way need to have given their permission for that data to be used for the purpose that we would like to put it to as researchers. And so creating a culture, which I think actually patients don't have a lot of problems with, where they more or less automatically, it's more of an opt-out mechanism, where their data is essentially freed up for use for research purposes as long as appropriate anonymization is put in place, could be a real enabler. And I think this is something we really struggle with in Alberta particularly, because I think Alberta tends to have a very protective view relative to other provinces in Canada. So we certainly struggle with this as academics in Alberta, but I think it's a relatively common problem across the country. The second point I would make is to do a joined upness in that whether it's at a provincial level or a federal level, when we start talking about acute care and chronic care, we suffer from really challenging problems in joining up our recognition of what holistic care really is. And this occurs in the field of people who are aging in place, where appropriate, relatively inexpensive interventions at the community level can save enormous amounts of money at the acute level. But the ability to move money across the divide and move policy across the divide and move administrative responsibility across the divide is a perplexing problem. And it doesn't make common sense, but it's the nature of the way things are put together. And that becomes a real barrier, I think, on the chronic disease management side of things, because it's difficult in isolation to demonstrate that you're saving money. But when you look at interventions and innovation holistically, and you include what the benefits are at the acute side, then it's a slam dunk. And I think that's the challenge we have, both at a provincial level and at a federal level.
Okay. If I could add something. So, I agree very much with what you said. And one connected element regarding the opt-in of patients to make sure their data could be used for research is we have to make sure that patients feel secure about that data. In particular, it has come to the Canadian government to the question of what insurance companies could be doing and asking from the data that has been measured on patients. And I think this is, I don't want to go into that debate, but obviously from the point of view of developing AI with patients' data, it's much, much better if patients feel confident that the data is not going to be used against them in one way or another.
Okay, thank you. Okay, Senator Unger to be followed by Senator Petitclerc.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you both very much for extremely interesting presentations. Dr. Bengio, just a comment. I really like your message about if you want to do business with us, come to Canada. I really applaud that, and it was very recently that I read in one of our national papers about a company in California that packed up and moved, and specifically regarding AI, moved to Toronto, I believe. So that's a great message. You talked about You work with dozens of companies and hundreds more knocking on your door. I'm wondering how you would handle all of this potential business.
Well, so precisely what we're going to be doing with a lot of the money that we'll be receiving from both the provincial government and the federal governments in the next few years is to make it possible for academics in my group to recruit applied researchers who are going to actually do the work of the technology transfer and working with companies. So the professors and the grad students, for the most part, will continue to do their basic research, their long-term research. We don't want to stop that. Otherwise, we're going to lose eventually to other places in the world where they're continuing to do this. And we won't have the attractive power that we currently have for talent. So what we need to do instead is to bring together in the same places. That's what these institutes are supposed to be about. The ones in Montreal, Toronto, and Edmonton. Both the fundamental researchers who are already there, but recruit a large number, potentially more than the number of students and professors that we currently have, will be former grad students, engineers, people who recruit from overseas, who will be at the interface between those companies and the research. So, for example, in my group, what we're telling those people is, when we're recruiting them, we're telling them, so you will be working. Your main mission is going to be to work with those companies, but that will be like 80% of your time, and 20% of your time will be essentially free, and you'll be able to collaborate with the grad students and the postdocs doing fundamental research, publish papers, so they get to stay connected with the advances in science, and they're motivated to be here rather than working in industry and maybe have better salaries.
Thank you. And Doctor, and for both of you, I had questions that have already been asked. But Dr. Ferguson-Pell, you mentioned funding because Alberta has that kind of system. Do you see a role in the private sector or for the private sector to get involved with your work?
Absolutely. In fact, I think the private sector might be the early adopter. And it might be one way that we can get, if you like, soft venture funding in order to get some of this off the ground at an early stage. Because if you can imagine, there are a number of interventions that a typical physical therapy clinic that delivers fee-for-service care that is out-of-pocket paid, where expanding the market for them by being able to reach out more effectively into rural communities would be a very appealing thing to do. It relies, of course, upon those more remote communities to be able to afford to buy that. So there is an underlying inequity around the delivery of, for example, physical therapy services. But in Alberta, for example, if you have a hip replacement or a knee replacement, you get a certain number of physical therapy visits associated with that. So that would be a very good starting point. The other thing that we're doing now, which I think is another opportunity where it's at the interface between the health system funding and the private funding, is an intervention called GLAD, which came out of Denmark. And this is a physical therapy intervention that is intended to delay the amount of time needed for you to have your knee or hip surgery. In other words, what the physical therapy program does is essentially extends the period of time that you can live comfortably and functionally with your normal hip or knee before you have to have an artificial replacement. So this has economic benefit to the healthcare system, and also to the patient, and a quality of life benefit to the patient, and also as an opportunity for a private clinic to be able to deliver that service. So there are these sort of overlap areas that I think are interesting areas for us to look at the beginning, because it gets kind of everybody on board, but we don't get into complex conversations about where is new money going to come from in order to deliver this service, which is always challenging, especially in difficult economic times.
Yes.
Thank you.
And, I just had one more short question.
All right.
Okay. I'm wondering also about security and privacy of data.
Yes. So the data that relates to things like force measurement and movement measurements and things like that is very easily encrypted. So and usually that would not carry much in the way of an identifier because the data is being streamed across in real time. So and then it's being stored in a relatively normal way. The tricky part is the video information. And there are protocols for doing that already in telemedicine. And they will need to be enhanced as we go forward, as we use this technology more and more. This technology is in place to be able to do that. It's a matter of just, in a way, getting the approvals and the acceptance that the encryption techniques are sufficiently robust for the system to accept.
Thank you. Senator Petitclerc.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you very much for being here. Thank you for your presentations. My question is for both of you, perhaps Mr. Bengio. I too come from Montreal, so I'll begin with you.
How democratic, if I may say, your sector and area are or will be. I get that, this is very exciting, and I guess maybe there's a few parts. Like I'm trying to get a sense of where it's driven from. Is it led by the businesses? Is it led by the academics, or a combination of both? And I guess the reason I want to know that is down the road how, because I see that there's a lot of investment and it's high technology. It seems to me a lot of this would be very expensive research and products. So how do you get that to the most Canadian? How is it going to help as many Canadians as possible? Because I see it that it could remain a very privileged access, or it could save the world. And I don't know, maybe your opinion on that, and if you can get me a sense of where it stands.
So maybe one part of the answer is something really nice happening in the machine learning scientific community, which is that it's currently, and has been for many years, as far as I remember, very open. So not only do scientists publish their work in the usual ways, but they publish their work even before it's been reviewed in what's called archive. So as soon as somebody has a good idea that's sufficiently fleshed, it's posted on the web. And this is not just the academics doing this. The researchers in industry, at least in the leading industry, AI industry, so that's companies like Google, Microsoft, Facebook, IBM, they do the same thing. And there's a lot of movement of ideas. So students spend some time in one place and then another place. So everybody knows what everybody's doing very fast. The reason I'm saying this is that for anyone who has the training, and of course there are thousands of people around the world who do, you can very quickly know if there's something new happening. So this is not like what you see in movies, where there's isolated scientists maybe working for a company discovering something big that no one knows about. This is not at all how it's working. That science is moving by actually pretty small steps, even though the impact could be important. important, but the science itself is moving by small steps on top of what others are doing, and everybody knows what is going on. And worse than that, the companies that are trying to be secretive are losing. They're losing ground, and that's why, for example, a company like Apple, which used to be extremely secretive, decided that as far as deep learning is concerned, at least, they would open up and they would start publishing. And for them, it was the only way they could recruit strong researchers in the area. Otherwise, they would not even be able to recruit them, because those researchers care more about being part of the community, being able to talk to their peers, and getting their feedback than having 10% or whatever better salary. So that means that, in a sense, anyone with the training can build their own thing. And even regarding patents, there has been a movement in the last few years by those major companies to either say that they wouldn't use their patents. They would only use their patents in a defensive way. In other words, they would not prevent other companies from using the science that they're producing, or even just not even patent the things that are more on the science side of things that they're doing. So that's very good. Also, even though it's true that it may take some capital to develop, mostly it's people. I mean, there is computing equipment, but it's mostly people. So it's not actually that capital expensive. But those things that are, a lot of the things that are being developed are already mass distributed. So if you use almost any of the Google services or a large part of the Facebook services, you're already using deep learning, and you're getting it almost for free. I mean, you're getting advertisement, but that's another problem. So that technology is being used, is sort of mass distributed, and so it's everybody's going to be a user and is already a user to some extent of these things. There's a question of democratization at the level of businesses. So I co-founded a company called Element AI, which is trying to make that kind of technology accessible to the other companies besides those big, IT companies. That those companies which don't have the expertise, and this is true of many Canadian companies, even large ones, even large multinationals. They just don't have the expertise. They don't have the talent, so they don't know how to jump into this. So there's an issue there. But companies like Element AI and IBM are making that kind of expertise available to other companies. So I'm not sure if I answered your question or if you had something else in mind.
Well, maybe if you could specifically when it comes to health, because we want to know the impact on health.
Right.
So is it your perception that it will, have a positive impact on the health of Canadians? Because in the end, that would be the desired result, right?
Right. So in a sense, this is related
Probably,
to what Martin talked about just earlier. So there are cases where it's fairly obvious that it's profitable for a company to build a product that will be used by hospitals, for example. So the example I gave earlier of medical images, this is an area that's booming because it's a very straightforward path from building technology to making money out of it. But I'm sure there'll be other cases where it's not so clear from a business point of view, and yet there could be really important positive social impact. And that's where having a strong role for governments, for example, these institutes that are being created, is good. So academics are very motivated by the idea that what they're going to be doing could impact positively a lot of people. And so in my group, we are ready to tackle problems where there is no company that is interested, but there are, medical doctors or hospitals who think that this is an important problem that could, be useful for many people, and then we just go and do it. And basically we're doing at the expense of our salaries, our professors, we are paid by the government. So we're doing things for the common good, And it wouldn't necessarily work like this if you were in a country where it was all driven by the immediate profit motive.
Merci. Thank you.
Thank you.
I don't know if you had anything to add on that.
No, I completely agree. I think it's covered it very nicely.
Merci.
Thank you. Okay, before I move to the second round, I want to ask a couple of things that have arisen. With regard to the confidence and the ethics of using data that you and Senator Eggleton began to discuss, Dr. Bengio, I thought you gave actually a very good example when you referred to the counting of cells. And in my opinion, it was a very good example because it focuses us on reality versus hypothesis. That we very quickly come to accept technology that gives us information that is beneficial to making a diagnosis or helping with issues. We cease very quickly not to worry about the ethics of the technology. Now, let's move up one scale to 3D imaging, brain imaging. How do we know that the interpretation of the brain image of a particular individual hasn't been influenced by the data that went in to telling the machine how to look for a brain and deal with it? Well, we just don't. If we have a brain injury, we want you to image us immediately. If we think we have a deterioration of mental capability, the first thing we want is an imaging. In fact, today it's getting so people almost ask for an MRI, whatever they're going into the hospital with. So, I think that one of the things we have to do as we look at these ethical issues around data concentration is the reality of how they're used and how they may benefit, and weigh the potential benefit against any potential negative issue. Now, it seems to me that we've had discussion here on where some of the issue could go is that we know in deep learning, and as we get further into deep learning, we know how the learning is structured. We've been informed on how it has gone from simple stacking of photocopies into modeling on the actual brain and how it works. And Canada has been a leader. Part of the reason we're a leader is we continued our neurological research beyond that of a number of other countries. And so we now get into a situation where the diagnosis of disease, we know that many diseases are culturally or ethnically related. They're statistically higher, more pronounced in certain ethnicities than in others. And so the issue then becomes, is there sufficient data moving into it to lead? And in my opinion, your simple example of the cell counting is a very good basis for us to reflect on, in that as we get sufficient data, it no longer matters, because if you get a total ethnic screen of a good solid sample of a population, then there's a much higher probability that any factors will be considered. In fact, there's probably more diversity within one ethnicity than there may be across ethnicity. We know that the genetic, particularly at the microbiome level of individuals, even within any given ethnicity, is considerably varied across that population. So those factors have to be taken into consideration now when we look at the microbe and so on. And so I don't want to go on length, because I do have a question for Dr. Ferguson-Pell. Is there anything in what I've just summarized there that causes you to focus in on a further answer to Senator Eggleton's question?
Right. So there's an issue which you, I think, raised, which is well studied now, is the issue of bias due to the particular choice of data that we're using to train the machine. So the machine is only imitating the things that it sees in the training data. And so if the training data reflects the biases of the people or the lack of diversity from which data came from, that will be also in the machine, at least if we don't do anything special about it. But we can do something about it. And for a few years, and actually some of those papers came from Canada, we've known some techniques that can help us reduce considerably that issue. The idea is if we also measure, say, the ethnicity, the quantity that would like, the variable that would like our system to be insensitive to, because we'd like maybe the system to take a decision irrespective of, say, gender, race, or whatever is the variable, we can do that. We can simply train it to predict those variables and then become insensitive to them in its other judgments. It's not necessarily perfect, but we have knowledge of the mechanisms to do that. And I could easily imagine that in some situations it could be something that's legally required, just as a form of, respect the values of a particular country, that some systems in medical areas or legal areas have those safeguards. So we know scientifically how it could be done. There's extra effort when somebody would deliver a product to maybe enforce these kinds of ways to make the system unbiased. And it may be at the expense of the accuracy of the system. So this is something that maybe companies won't do unless they're asked to.
Yeah, well, thank you. And you said something I wanted to get on I was hoping you would say, and that is the implication that if we get sufficient data across sufficient ethnicities, we not only have the capacity for a first scan to give us a more highly likely successful scan, but we have the ability to ask the second question. That is, okay, now you've given us this data. If you take your data subset of a particular ethnicity and apply it to the sample that you're dealing with, does the machine, when we're talking to our robotic instrument here, does your interpretation of what you have just scanned change?
Right.
So ultimately, we have the capacity, potentially, if we scan sufficient data into the system, to not only get a general quick answer, which may be absolutely correct the first time through, but to refine questions based on different body structures, ethnicity, and so on. So I'll leave it just at that at this point and want to go to Dr. Ferguson-Pell. Dr. Ferguson-Pell, I was really struck by the hollow port example that you gave, which, if I understood correctly, is in the first instance the ability to bring the global three-dimensional physical structure into view, but at first glance doesn't go internally within the individual. So I want to take that next step. Mm-hmm. Now, the question that I've been asking with regard to our abilities with optics and deep learning, that is having a reference background, is surgeries in very difficult areas, two that are in very close proximity but involve two very different disease issues, but are complicated because of their location: anal cancer and prostate cancer.
Yep.
And we know that errors are made in both because the surgeon is unable to see all at once behind an organ, in the intricacy, and so on, and a very slight nick in those areas can do long-term damage. There are reports that the system is becoming advanced rapidly in giving a three-dimensional on-screen view of the area in which the surgery has to occur, and to actually reveal details of the physical structure, the proximity of various systems, I'll leave it at that are in both those areas, all of which are enormously important and very tightly packed. Do you see, from what your experience with the Holoport, do you see this being able to move internally and being able to help with that presentation in those, taking the two examples that I gave?
Yes, I think that we're already seeing it, but not in real time, and that is in surgical planning. So if you take images that have been created, for example, CT images or MRI images, and you know a procedure that's going to be followed. So the example that we have at the U of A that I think is quite compelling when you see it is replacing a heart valve that was previously implanted and now needs to be replaced. And this is a catheter procedure, so it's not open heart surgery. But of course, it's pretty tricky to feed the instruments through the veins to get to the right place and then remove the old valve, put a new one in, especially if it's not located ideally. So to be able to rehearse that operation before it's undertaken significantly, or has the potential to significantly reduce the risks of the kinds of problems you're describing. So I would say the low-hanging fruit in this area would be in surgical planning and rehearsing and simulating a situation, but doing it with the patient's own data. So what we've been used to in the past is generic models that are produced that enable people to practice. Recently, in some areas, individual customized models are made of the patient themselves, where you can practice the procedure. But that requires, producing a physical model, which is, of course, where 3D printing can be helpful. But the opportunity in VR and AR is that you can take that MRI image and you can take it for that individual patient. You can start to rehearse the procedure, but also you can change its scale. So unlike the physical device where you're fixed with the scale, this you can actually get inside. I mean, you can take a look around from the perspective of the blood vessel or from another part of the heart, for example, where you're wanting to see, exactly what the shape is. So that's where I think the immediate opportunities lie in that kind of surgery.
Thank you very much. That was great. I want to come to the issue of confidentiality of information. It seems to me that in Canada we have been substantially retarded, held back in the health area because of our paranoia over privacy of information. For example, we still do not have electronic health records for Canadians. And my looking at that, we've had testimony from Canada Infoway and others here. We have delved into this in a number of areas. I'm increasingly of the view that the requirements put on providers where they have confidentiality protection as the highest requirement in the RFP for these things is such that it makes it virtually impossible to make a practical electronic health record. If we can't even do an electronic health record, we're not going to get to the things that you're talking about here, using data in Canada to base decisions for instrumentation development, technological developments, and so on, we're already at a disadvantage. Even on our national population is smaller than one state in particular, a very advanced state south of us, and so we have to be able to deal with it. I'm always amazed that we have this paranoia in this particular area, whereas in our income tax, people are jumping over themselves to get an electronic submission of their income tax, and I've heard numbers as high as 80% this year may be in an electronic format, and I suspect in terms of immediate injury to people, there is nothing more potentially sensitive than their private financial information, and yet we've been able to deal with that in these kinds of areas. So I really just want to come back to the issue that you've raised. I believe the access to large data is critical for our companies moving forward to be able to help Canadians, let alone to be able to compete in the products in the end. And so we have to be able to deal with this issue. And the real issue I think that you did touch on in going through it is the protection against using an individual's data against their opportunity for employment or for those are very real, but they're different than the issue of total data in a system analyzed for things that appear to arise in a given disease symptom over a wide range of patients in a wide range of different sorts of things. And if we are going to be as advanced as Dr. Bengio wants us to be with regard to artificial intelligence and its benefits to Canadians, we have to be capable of dealing with a realistic problem. Otherwise, we're not going to get there. Okay, I'm going to turn to the second round now, and I'll start with Senator Eggleton, and I have Senator Seidman next. Senator Stewart Olson.
Well, gentlemen, the government in Bill C-43 provided for $125 million to the Canadian Institute for Advanced Research, CFAR, support a pan-Canadian artificial intelligence strategy, and I understand, Professor Bengio, you're involved with that. What are the components that you see of this strategy, and what is the timetable you see in the development of it?
So there are a number of components. The bulk of the money is going to the three institutes. So as far as I know, for Montreal and Toronto, there's the plan would be to have something like $40 million over 5 years. And out of those 40 millions, 30 would be used for chairs, so basically to attract and retain the best professors in the area and pay for students and postdocs and so on. And 10 millions would be for allowing for the operations of the institute. That's over the 5 years, so that's like 2 millions per year. And I don't remember the numbers for Edmonton, but these are, I don't think these have been made official. This is from the discussions that I've been part of. And then, so that comes to about $100 million. And then the rest goes to more pan-Canadian activities managed by CFAR. So one aspect of which is to promote the discussions around the ethical and social aspects of AI. Another is to encourage collaboration between the different centers. And finally, there's a $10 million to help other places than the three major cities for AI here. For example, UBC used to have a pretty important machine learning group, but unfortunately, due to the brain drain, most of them went away. They could recruit more, and then that money could be used to help them attract professors in this area. So that's roughly the division as far as I know. And your other question was?
Time frame.
Time frame, yes. So the three institutes are being set up. The Vector Institute in Toronto is already being created just a few weeks ago. Hopefully the one in Montreal is going to happen in the next few weeks. And the plan is basically that all three will start operations within this year.
So will this strategy unfold in increments? Will there be reports from time to time as to its progress?
Yes. So CFAR has been mandated as the organization which will monitor progress. They're already doing this for their usual programs that are fundamental research programs.
Yes.
And there is whatever it's called, a secretariat or a committee which is going to be put in place to evaluate, but also to take global decisions. For example, put the bar on the quality of the applicants for those chairs in a way that's going to be consistent across the country.
Okay. Do you think the amount of money being invested by the federal government is, I mean, it's always nice to have more, but is it sufficient to make a difference?
So that money is really to help with the basic research aspect. what we are working towards is getting also some money from the federal government for the innovation aspect. In other words, you remember I told you that we want to build institutes which have both the basic research groups and sort of the applied technology transfer groups, and I think that extra funding is going to be needed for making that happen. The provinces are putting money that's for both, but I think having the extra money from the federal government for this would be important, because of course, if we only invest in the university research and we don't also help the transfer, then we're losing a big opportunity to make the whole thing really succeed.
Let me ask Dr. Ferguson-Pell whether there's any federal support into the program, or is it entirely the province of Alberta?
The one I'm describing at the moment, it's mainly in our area. But what I would, apart from the CFI funding that we've received, the MITEX funding, and so on, so small amounts of funding, but they can have a good impact. What I would say is that the interesting thing about the field that we're working in is that it's a pretty eclectic field, and so there are many secondary benefits of, for example, the funding that is going into machine learning indirectly benefits us too, in that imagine that data that is being sent from a rural location into that urban hub and put into a repository, and you do that nationwide, and you start to be able to mine that and start looking at trajectories of care and being able to predict what the outcome for a patient might be with a complex chronic disease that needs to be managed with a lot of resources and a lot of careful planning. Machine learning is probably the only way that we're really going to be able to get to the bottom of what those trajectories are. But what I would say is that we have to expand our concept of what we mean by data, in that earlier on we were talking about genetic profiles, for example. People talk about metabolites and other measurements that are made that get put into a data pool that lend themselves very nicely to machine learning. But let me give you another scenario, a chronic wound, a huge problem, an extremely expensive problem for our healthcare system. What data are we generating around chronic wounds? What are we measuring? What do we look for? What characterizes a chronic wound? What helps us to understand what the appropriate treatment for a chronic wound is? How can we optimize the rate of repair to that chronic wound? How can we decide when it should be treated with conservative management versus plastic surgery? So there is one condition that is actually a very major expense within our system, that is not a particularly pleasant topic to talk about. It doesn't attract the intelligentsia of academia to work on because it's messy. And yet, I think it's actually a very interesting area that could be looked at, that could be one that would benefit from using machine learning techniques. So I go back to the point, and I think that is that when this basic research is done, the benefits to society rely heavily upon our imagination and ability to apply it in interesting areas and challenging areas and important areas, including chronic wounds.
What are you calling a chronic wound?
A pressure ulcer, a diabetic ulcer, a surgical site that hasn't repaired properly, and so on.
I see. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Senator Seidman.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you both very much for your continuing offering to us of very stimulating materials. Professor Bengio, you mentioned Element AI, but we didn't hear any real description of how that fits into this whole puzzle that you've presented and this hub. There's pan-Canadian aspects. I mean, there are a lot of moving parts here. So
yes,
and I know that's always that way when we're in the midst of major innovation. So how does Element AI fit into this whole picture?
So we're trying to build an ecosystem, including academics, including small companies and incubators, startups, large existing corporate, and Element AI started as a small startup last fall and is now becoming a medium company very quickly. There are probably going to break the record for the largest round A funding investment that's probably going to come in the next few weeks. So there's a huge interest for these kinds of companies in Canada and elsewhere in the world. So they're going to be, in a sense, complementary to the kinds of things we're doing with the institutes. So the institutes are academic-led. They are not-for-profit. Element AI is a company, so it is for-profit, and so in a sense, and Element AI is going to already has recruited a number of high-level researchers. So it's doing both basic research and fairly applied research. So one could think that, but this, why do we have the institutes and companies like this? Because it's a different way of operating, right? And we attract different kinds of people, and we solve different kinds of problems. So there are all of these different actors, and Element AI is, I think, playing an important role, as at least for the Montreal ecosystem, in having a fairly large group that has a lot of international visibility to attract the kinds of people who are currently going to, say, DeepMind in London, which is one of the largest company doing AI these days. They can compete with those kinds of companies that are specialized in AI and are large enough to attract really strong people.
Is there, part of this is what you've described before, Mila, for example.
Yeah.
It's private-public, so there's government funding and private funding involved,
Yes,
correct?
yes, but it's really a non-profit. So even though we are getting contracts from companies, we choose which contracts we take. And what guides our decisions are, how much is it going to impact the ecosystem? How good is it going to be in terms of social impact? So these considerations, of course, are things we can have the luxury to consider if we are a government-funded organization. But a company like Element AI is going to look for profit, which addresses a different objective.
Okay, you've already anticipated where I'm going with my line of questioning here, because that's exactly what I was trying to understand was how you determine priorities and if you even do determine priorities and on what basis. So the Mila, for example, there's a social good element.
Yes, exactly.
And then I might take it just one step further, given that our committee's has particular interest in healthcare.
Yeah.
And so
we're putting a lot of emphasis on healthcare applications, irrespective of whether they're going to be profitable. And for these, in many cases, we're talking to a lot of medical researchers, and we're going to get our funding, well, in part from what the government already gives us, but also from existing other government funding like CIHR or NSERC and things like this, and potentially companies where it's appropriate. So it's going to be a mix. But at the end of the day, we're not limited by purely, is this investment profitable in 2 years or something like that.
Is there some indication you can give us about what the best investments could be in the health field, where it could have the most impact, what your brain power tells you are the real, the real investments for the future?
Right. So the medical images is a no-brainer. It's the low-hanging fruit, and that's why there are already companies involved there. I think another area, but that depends on our ability to collect the data, is helping to, for example, process medical reports that are in natural language. So one thing that's happening with deep learning is that we can now use computers to extract information from pure texts. It doesn't have to be structured data. And doctors' reports are even hard for humans to make sense of. So this is a place where we could, extract a lot of information. In fact, this could be used also as a complement to medical images, or to train the machine about, what did the doctor think about what was the problem with that person based on the medical image. So there's a lot of places around medical data where we have the usual numbers, tests, and so on. But the new thing, really, besides our ability to take advantage of large quantities of data, is our ability to exploit textual data. So, we have to make sure that we collect that data. Usually it's the case, I know in Quebec at least. But that opens up a lot of potential applications where those reports could be used to help train other systems or to reduce the workload of people who process those reports and so on.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, I think we have probably exhausted this issue in a general sense today, certainly not in terms of the actual applications and implications. Dr. Ferguson-Pell, we were fascinated a number of years ago when we were asked to review the health accord, and we looked at health delivery across the country of some of the really interesting telemedicine examples that were occurring in the West, centered in Winnipeg and Saskatoon and so on. And your illustration has added to that the tremendous potential that exists there. Ultimately, of course, we know from all of the observations that no matter what it is you're dealing with in health, the very best place to recover most quickly and most is in the home, or at least in your local area. And we know that the technologies that are evolving have the enormous potential to help deal with that, to take the very example you gave and take it to somebody, the practitioner, the nurse practitioner in the home, dealing with the person at the center, based on a diagnosis that has already been provided on the basis of information gathered and transported to either a robotic tool or to a real practitioner who's interpreting that data as it's coming in. So some of the issues, I don't want you to respond to this today, but if you have any thoughts as you go forward, these are going to have enormous impacts. They're going to be very disruptive to a healthcare system that is already overburdened, largely because of lack of innovation and delivery of healthcare. And so particularly to you, Dr. Ferguson-Pell, as you go away, and if you have any thoughts about how, we don't really have a system in Canada. We have a collection of balkanized systems. And so how are we going to innovate in actually responding to the demand from citizens who are going to be able to have a pretty good idea that they've got to have a response on a medical condition, that their iPhone has just told them that they've got to get to a center based on that sort of thing. So I'm going to leave you with a request to think about that. And of course, Dr. Bengio, we would like to have any thoughts you might have with regard to the large impact issues you've been dealing with in AI. I happen to think that we have finally moved to something where we are a laggard in international competition is true centers of excellence that bring in a broad spectrum of interrelated activities. In the biotech area, we were not able to advance as rapidly because we were not able to get a collection of expertise in a center where the applications would occur immediately. Because as you have hinted at as you go through it, the researcher level, in order for the researchers to know exactly how they can benefit, they have to be in dialogue with people who have needs of the use of knowledge. And so to, again, use the biotechnology example, in San Diego alone, there are more biotech companies than there are in all of Canada. You go out to lunch, and you two are sitting on adjacent tables, and you spot one another, and you say to Dr. Ferguson-Pell, look, we just observed this, and I heard you give a talk just the other day. That's how it spreads. And so I'm hopeful that in the AI area, where we are really putting serious money into bringing collections together, that we in Canada will move forward with true centers that will have the huge magnitude of impact and benefit for Canadians, but also in the larger sense, the economic and the knowledge-based sense, from delivering to the world and bringing back to Canada. So I want to thank you both very much for being here. And if you have any further thoughts, communicate through our clerk, and we'll be delighted to hear from you. Once again, thanks to my colleagues, and we'll see you, my colleagues at least, tomorrow.